Hello, this is Mrs. Grosch, and the topic for today is big rocks. Now, you've been studying rocks and minerals, but small ones, something you can hold in your hand and look at up close. Now we're going to start talking about bigger rocks, much, much bigger, as big as mountains. Rocks that big, they're called landforms, and in this video you'll start to learn what they are and what produces them. When you think about what the Earth looks like, you might have a picture in your mind that looks kind of like this. But if you could only see the Earth's crust, you might see something more like this. The crust is the solid part of the Earth's geosphere, and most of the time we don't see it. It's hidden under the Earth's hydrosphere, which is its water, and its biosphere, which are the living things on Earth. The crust is really important. It's a solid layer of rock, although it does have some cracks in it called fissures. It's between 5 and 30 kilometers thick, and it's thinner under the oceans and thicker under the continents. That's why the water can pile up under the ocean parts. The crust is mostly made of two types of igneous rock, basalt and granite. Now, I know there's lots of other types of rocks on the world, but those are the covering over the crust. The crust is covered with those smaller pieces of rock and also soil and plants and water, which is why we don't see it very often. Now, the Earth's crust is not actually smooth. It has lots of different bumps and other deformities, and those shapes are called landforms. There's lots of examples of landforms. Here are some of the ones that you should probably know about. Plateaus, a couple different kinds of mountains, volcanic and tectonic mountains, canyons and caves, valleys, especially a kind of valley called a U-shaped valley because of the way it looks. All of these different landforms are created by different causes, but we can call those causes either constructive forces or destructive forces. Now, constructive forces, they build up the crust. They build it up from things that are happening underneath the Earth's surface. And we're going to learn about those, but we'll do it in a different lecture. What we're going to learn about today are destructive forces. And these are things that are happening out in the environment on the surface of the Earth, and they break down the crust and move it around. And they do give the crust different shapes. Those different shapes are what makes the Earth interesting, so that it's not all flat everywhere. The destructive forces that you should know about really fall into three categories, and they work together. The categories are weathering, erosion, and deposition. Basically, weathering is what breaks big pieces of rock into small pieces of rock, and erosion moves those small pieces of rock around. Erosion can't last forever, so eventually those little pieces of rock will fall and pile up, and that's called deposition. Let's start by learning about weathering. Weathering is the way that rock gets broken down. There's two main categories of weathering. The first is called physical weathering. This is when rock gets broken down, but the kind of rock that it is doesn't change. Its chemicals stay the same. Three main ways that this happens are through abrasion, and abrasion is when rock really gets ground up because it's exposed to sediments that are moving. Maybe they're moving because the wind is picking them up, or maybe they're moving in water. But those moving sediments can grind up the surface of rock. Another way that rock can get broken down is through ice. If rock has small cracks in it and then water gets into those cracks and freezes, the ice that forms will actually expand and make the cracks bigger and bigger and bigger until finally the rock breaks into smaller pieces. Something else that can get into cracks in rocks are plant roots. We call this root pry, and plants can actually crack rocks open when their roots grow into them. Something else that can affect rocks in the environment is chemicals. There's lots of chemicals that are just naturally occurring in the environment. And when they react chemically with the rocks, they can actually start to break the rocks down. One example of this is when rocks react with oxygen in the air. This can form a chemical reaction we call oxidation, and it basically produces rust. Rust isn't very strong, so it's a way that rocks can get broken down. Something else that will do a similar thing to rocks is acid. Now, acid doesn't usually form in the environment, but there are mild acids that form when rainwater reacts with chemicals in the air and in the ground. And those mild acids that form can dissolve certain types of rock, and they can even form caves, like the one you see in this picture. Once those pieces of rock are made smaller by weathering, they can be moved around by erosion. Erosion is usually caused by one of four things: wind, gravity, moving water, and glaciers. All of those natural things can pick up those pieces of sediment and move them around. And that's what erosion is. It's movement of sediments from one place to another. Eventually, whatever forces are moving those sediments around are going to weaken. Maybe the wind dies down. Maybe a river that's moving sediments empties out into a lake and the water slows down. When those moving sediments begin to slow down, they're going to drop because friction and gravity are going to pull them down towards the surface of the earth. And when that happens, we have the final destructive force called deposition. This is where sediments begin to pile up and stay in one place. It can make landforms too, like the sand dune that you see or the landslide in that picture. One thing you should know about deposition of sediments is that generally bigger, heavier pieces will settle faster than smaller pieces that are more lightweight. And that makes sense. But that actually helps us to figure out what happens in a particular place because we can compare the sediment sizes that are left behind. We almost always talk about weathering, erosion, and deposition together because they work together to create landforms. Weathering breaks down rock into small pieces. The pieces probably won't move if they're big, so you have to have weathering first before erosion can take over. Erosion moves those pieces, and when they stop moving, we have deposition. You can't have deposition if those pieces weren't moving to begin with. So all three of those destructive forces work together to shape the Earth's surface. And the shapes that we get, courtesy of those destructive forces, are called landforms. Now there's constructive forces too, which are from inside the Earth, but we'll learn about those another day. For now, you know some basics about landforms and some of the things that cause them. Thanks for listening. I'll see you in class tomorrow.